Hi.
Hey, here we go. Here's some more people.
Well, howdy, gang. How is everybody?
Hello, how are you?
I had a day off, so life was good. Thanks for asking.
Every day is off for me.
You're bragging, Harold.
Well, it's been that way for 20 years.
I'll get there someday. I hope.
I hope you do too. Mindy,
Yeah,
is Lewis and Joel going to join us?
I don't think so. I think Joel has a dinner tonight.
Oh, okay.
Um, he had some dinner at the hospital or something.
I see.
I don't think so. So it's me.
I hope Fred joins us.
Yeah. You're a little early. You're 4 minutes early.
Uh, he's usually here.
Good afternoon.
Hi.
Hey, John, how are you?
Hmm.
Chris, how have you been?
I could tell you the truth, but nobody wants to hear it. But I've been good, thanks. Been busy. Had
And
a
Rachel?
Doing good. How about you? How are Paul and Gabby? I haven't seen them in a while.
So, Chris, you've been working extraordinary hours.
Unfortunately, yeah, I had two of my staff in the hospital over Memorial Day week.
Mm.
And one of them is a close friend, so we've been we've been kind of taking care of him, which is why we haven't been here the last couple weeks. We've been toting him around to doctor's appointments and all that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So,
Yeah,
but he's back home now, so here we
right.
are.
That's great. Well, I was doing something that you all probably would find really neat. I was with a fella whose family's got numbers of generations that live here in Oklahoma. And we were visiting a site along an old creek bed that used to have a grist mill in it in the 1800s.
It's a bad one.
And it was a little community there, and they'd bring in grain and grind it there. And there's not much that remains at all, but it was really a neat experience to get from. He's talking about what his father and his grandfather told him about, the area and what have you. So it's pretty neat. But it's getting warm and lots of brush. We spent quite a bit of time.
Well, I missed the first part. Like I was saying, our connection's pretty terrible today.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah. But I'm with you on the hot. It's getting nice out, at least
Yeah.
here.
I'm glad you all are back.
Good to be back. And there's Fred.
Yep, Fred has arrived.
Yeah.
Hey,
Fred,
Harold.
you've got a new name. It's called CBI Administrator. How about that? You've
Really?
been
Yeah,
promoted.
I noticed that. Yeah,
Fred's moving up in the world.
right. Okay. Okay. Well, I think everybody's here. We can get started. Tonight we were going to talk about the beginning of the modern era in Jewish history, and that's on page 16 if you're following it in the outline. Um, you don't usually think of 1789 as a significant Jewish history date. It's the date of the French Revolution. And it doesn't seem like it would be a Jewish thing in history, but actually it is an important Jewish date because the French Revolution, together with our revolution in 1776, really marked the achievement of what we call the 18th century European Enlightenment. The transition from the Middle Ages into the modern world, which occurred in the 18th century and really had major impact on Jewish life. And the Enlightenment had a number of roots. One of them, of course, was the rise of science, starting with Galileo in the 16th century and then Newton in the 17th century. There was now a new explanation for how the world worked. Not everything had to be an act of God. And then that was matched by a corresponding decline in religious influence. And this actually was really the fault of the church itself, more or less, not necessarily to the rise of science. After the Reformation in the early 16th century, for about 100 years, somewhere between 100 and 150 years, you had Catholics and Protestants slaughtering each other all over Europe. The religious wars that followed the Reformation. And basically, organized religion basically shot itself in the foot. I mean, people looked at this, and after decades of this, many of them just turned their backs on religion altogether. It was really the beginning of a secular Europe that you have today. Also, before the Reformation, there was only one church. So you had only one church in Europe claiming to be the true church, the true religion. Then you had Luther, and you had two churches, both claiming to be the true religion. But then Protestantism began to split into denominations. Then you have the Calvinists, and then the Anabaptists, and on and on and on. And then when you had 15 different denominations, all claiming to be the true religion, what you basically got is a lot of skepticism. And this was also combined with the exploration of a new world, the Western Hemisphere, that began in the 16th century. People discovered there were advanced civilizations that had never heard of Western civilization, never heard of Western religion, and were doing just fine. It changed your real view of the world. And it was in France, really, this first became a political thing with the revolution. And of course, this was a major thing for the Jews. One of the things that the Revolutionary Assembly spent an entire day on, an entire session on, was a debate over whether the rights of man, which was the new constitution for France, whether the rights of man uh, um, really applied to the Jews. Should Jews be citizens of France? And they decided that it did, which marked the first time in European history the Jews were actually citizens of the country they lived in. They weren't possessions of the king the way they were in the medieval world. They weren't, just outsiders that wandered from country to country. They actually were citizens of a modern European state. Of course, the thing was kind of academic in France because the Jews had been expelled from France back in 1303. So there were hardly any Jews living in France at the time. The only significant Jewish community was Alsace and Lorraine, because those were originally German and the French took them away from the Germans during the wars of Louis XIV. But those were really the only Jews that were actually in France at the time. And it actually was a challenge for the Jews. The doors of the ghettos were opening finally. And you see with Napoleon, everywhere Napoleon's armies went, whether it was northern Italy or Austria or Western Germany, everywhere the French revolutionary armies went, they literally knocked down the walls of the Jewish ghettos. There was an emancipation of the Jews everywhere where the French army went, which some Jews had some skepticism about. There's a famous story that one day in the year 1812, in a little village in Poland, in the town square, there were a couple of rabbis sitting there, and they were watching all day long. Columns of French soldiers were moving through the town. They were forming up for Napoleon's invasion of Russia. And one of the rabbis said to the other one, who should we pray for to win this thing, Napoleon or the Tsar? And the other rabbi says, I'm praying for the Tsar. And the other one says, how can you do that? You know how miserable things are for us in Russia. The Tsar hates us. Look at the pogroms, look at the way we're treated in Russia. How can you possibly want the Tsar to win this? Well, the other one said, because if Napoleon wins, he's going to bring all these liberal French ideas to Russia. We're going to be citizens of Russia. Our children are going to go to Russian universities. They're going to fraternize with non-Jews. They're going to intermarry. They're going to be lured away from Judaism. We're better off keeping our identity and our religion and being even in the miserable life in Russia than losing that and losing our souls. The decisions Jews really had to make was life better in the ghetto. In the Middle Ages, it probably was. The Ashkenazi Jews living in Central and Eastern Europe during the Middle Ages, there was really nothing outside the ghetto that it was really worth having. There was no civilization. The Jews weren't missing anything by not being part of medieval civilization. But now with the Renaissance and the Reformation, there were really great things going on in Europe, great things in the sciences, great things in the arts. And there was an attraction outside of the ghetto. And Jews were going to have to make the choice really between staying in the ghetto, preserving their traditional life or actually mixing with the outside world, becoming part of Europe, and trying to still hold on to their religion. And of course, the debate is still really going on as to what they should do. Some of the Jews decided that life was better in the ghetto, that there was nothing outside Jewish culture that was valuable, and that they basically needed to stay with their own people and really turn their backs on the outside world. And you still see that. These are the Jews we call the ultra-Orthodox. Actually, they don't like to be called ultra-Orthodox because ultra is kind of a pejorative term. If you call something ultra, you're saying there's too much of it or it's gone too far. And as far as they're concerned, they're just doing the minimum God required. It's the rest of us that are slackers. They don't consider themselves ultra at all. And actually, the name they've taken for themselves, that they still use today, is Haredi Jews or Haredim. And the term comes really from the Hebrew verb charad, which means to tremble. There's a verse that occurs several times in Isaiah that says, Ha-charedim al devaro, which means those who tremble before his word. And they've decided to take that description for themselves. So they refer to themselves as Haredi Jews or Haredim. You know, if you go to New York or Boston or Baltimore, you know, you'll see them. They're the guys with the black hats, you know, and the long black coats, and wearing that uniform. And they have simply rejected the outside secular society. You know, if you go into their homes, there's no television, there's no radio. If they have a computer, most of the internet is blocked out. They don't go to the movies, they don't go to the theater. Their children are homeschooled or else go to their own religious schools. They've simply decided to opt out, of modern civilization. And then you have the Jews that made the other decision, and that was the beginning of what we call modern Orthodoxy. You know, Jews who feel that you can be, a fully observant Jew and still participate completely, with the overall society. You know, these are guys like, Joe Lieberman, who's a senator from Connecticut, who's an observant Orthodox Jew who still had a successful political career. And there are a number of modern Orthodox that do this. Napoleon, it was kind of interesting, and also in that he loved to make great theatrical gestures. One of the things he did, he decided to attract more Jews back into France. You know, now the Jews were going to be French citizens. He was going to reconstitute the Sanhedrin, and so he actually picked out rabbis from all over who wanted to come to Paris and actually be a Sanhedrin. Actually, they weren't given any real power at all. They were simply there, to act as Napoleon's press agent to the Jews, essentially, to sort of to justify what he was doing to the Jewish population. But during, one of his first military adventures, though, was his Egyptian campaign. He went with his army to the Middle East, was campaigning in Egypt, and it turned out to be a complete failure. He really was unable to keep his army supplied. The British Navy, blockaded him there. And he was really kind of in desperate straits. And what he actually did was he sent out a proclamation to the world's Jews that if they would come and aid him, that he would see that a Jewish state could be set up in the Middle East. It was the Balfour Declaration 100 years before Balfour, but nobody responded. So the whole thing was a failure. The only thing that came out of it was any worth that one of his engineers found the Rosetta Stone and brought it back. But otherwise, it was a total military failure. The Jews in England had a little bit different kind of experience. They had been kicked out of England in 1290 by Edward I, but Oliver Cromwell, invited them back, in the middle of the 17th century. And so there was a thriving Jewish community in England by the end of the 17th century. And there wasn't really any specific anti-Jewish discrimination. There was discrimination overall in that the Anglican Church was the established Church of England, and there were certain things that you couldn't do if you weren't an Anglican. You couldn't be a member of Parliament. You couldn't hold a high rank in the army. You couldn't study at Oxford or Cambridge unless you're a member of the Anglican Church. But that was also true of Catholics or Methodists or Quakers or anybody who wasn't an Anglican. So there were no specific anti-Jewish laws. And again, most of that had been taken away by the end of the 19th century, but with reform legislation. The most interesting transition was in Germany. Napoleon never conquered all of Germany, but he did conquer a lot of the Western German states. Germany wasn't really a unified nation there. And so some of the ideas of the Enlightenment did come to Germany. And the person who really pushed them was a man named Moses Mendelssohn, one of the great figures in European Jewish history. He was born in the early 18th century in Dessau, Germany. His father was a Torah scribe, a very learned man. He received a really deep Jewish education. And when he was 14 years old, the rabbi of Dessau was offered a post in Berlin, and he asked Moses Mendelssohn to come along with him. So Mendelssohn accompanied him to Berlin, and he was one of these really brilliant polymath type person. while he was in Berlin as a teenager, he already knew Hebrew and Aramaic and German, from his own education at home. But he taught himself French, Latin, Greek, and English, self-taught as a teenager. Um, and he actually was the first Jew to move in German intellectual circles. And one day, while he was at a coffee shop, he met the German playwright Lessing, Gotthold Lessing, and they bonded almost immediately. They actually met over a chess game, and they found out that they were both Spinoza fans, and that led to a lifelong friendship. And actually, Lessing actually wrote a play called Nathan the Wise, in which it was a play in which a Jew was the main character, was a protagonist, seen in a positive light. He actually modeled it after Moses Mendelssohn, main character. And this was a landmark. This was the first time in European history that any Jew had ever been portrayed in a positive light on the European stage. Before, the only thing you had was Shakespeare's Shylock and The Merchant of Venice, or you had Christopher Marlowe's Jew of Malta. The Jews were always devils, they were always villains in the European imagination. And this really was a major breakthrough when Nathan the Wise appeared on the German stage. And Mendelssohn was pushed very strongly the idea that the Jews had to leave the ghetto. They had they had to get into modern European life, and there was no reason why you couldn't be a good observant Jew and be a good German or a good European at the same time. And a lot of people followed him. He's really one of the founders of what we call modern Orthodoxy today. Um, However, there were a lot of other people who felt that there were better ways to do it. They really felt that Orthodox Judaism was really holding them back. It was really just too strange, too weird, too Oriental, or too Middle Eastern. It didn't really fit in modern Europe. And there ought to be ways of changing Judaism to make it really more acceptable. What they were really talking about is you wanted a synagogue that you wouldn't be embarrassed to bring your German Lutheran friends to. And this was the beginning of Reform Judaism, right toward the end of the 18th century. And the reasoning the reformers used actually was pretty sound reasoning at first. What they said was, there are a lot of things about traditional Judaism that have nothing to do with biblical law. It's not from commandments in the Torah. It's really just reflects the Middle Eastern origin of the religion. And there's no reason to keep that if you're living in modern Europe. For instance, observant Jews in a synagogue cover their head. Very Orthodox Jews cover their head at all times, in or out of the synagogue. And, there's no commandment anywhere in the Hebrew Bible to cover your head. In fact, there's really nothing in the rabbinic writings of the Talmud about covering your head. It's just an old Middle Eastern social custom, that carried over into the religion. In the West, we take off our hats as a sign of respect. In the Middle East, you put on your hat. So they said, why do we have to keep covering our heads in a synagogue? And then they said, why are we even calling it a synagogue? Synagogue really has kind of a medieval tinge to it. We need something that's more exalted, that's a little bit more formal. Why not call it a temple? And of course, to the Orthodox Jews, this was sheer blasphemy. To the Orthodox, there was only one temple that stood in Jerusalem, and it's not going to be rebuilt until the Messiah comes. And calling any other building a temple is blasphemy. But the German Reformed Jews began the tradition of calling a Reformed house of worship a temple. And even to this day in America, if a congregation is called temple something, it's a 95% chance it's a Reformed congregation. They're the only ones who use it, with a couple of exceptions. There's Temple Israel in Charlotte, which is conservative, but they're one of the rare exceptions. And then they said, why does the service have to be in Hebrew? I mean, it's traditional, but that's only because Hebrew and Aramaic were the languages of the old Middle East. There's no law in the Torah that tells you what language to pray in. Why can't you just pray in any language you know? Why can't the synagogue service be in the vernacular of any country you live in? Why not German instead of Hebrew? So they took the Hebrew out of the service. And then why can't men and women sit together instead of separated as an Orthodox synagogue? Again, this is not a Torah commandment. There's nothing anywhere in the Torah or the entire Tanakh that says anything about men and women being separated. It's just an old Middle Eastern social custom that got carried into religious practice. And so they started doing away with this. The service would be in German. And then why can't there be an organ or piano to accompany things? There's no law in the Torah against musical instruments. There were musical instruments in the temple. And the only reason a traditional synagogue doesn't have them is that the rabbis set that up as a mourning custom. When the Romans destroyed the Second Temple, the rabbis decided that since instrumental music was part of the old temple, it would not be in the synagogue as kind of a mourning sign that, that it was part of the temple and the temple is gone. But again, that's really just a rabbinic thing. It's not really Torah law. So, why not have an organ? And so, again, men and women sat together. The service was in German. It was accompanied by an organ. Nobody bothered to cover their heads. And as they progressed into the 19th century, um, that they decided, there's a lot of other things that don't really fit, in the modern world. A lot of the of rabbinic law, really doesn't have any rationale. And it may have had a rationale back then. We don't know what the reason was behind some of these rules. But why should we keep carrying on something that we don't really know the reason for anymore, just out of sheer habit over the years? For instance, the dietary laws. Nobody really knows the rationale for being able to eat certain foods and not being able to eat others. People have tried to invent rationales with health and all this, but there's no evidence at all that a kosher diet is really good for you or better for you than any other kind of diet. It has something to do with the concept of ritual purity. Certain things are ritually pure and certain aren't. And that's not a concept we really have in the modern world. They really couldn't get their 19th century heads around, the concept of ritual purity or ritual impurity. So, why not just drop the dietary laws? And then the Sabbath, why do you really have to be so strict about the Sabbath? Maybe the rationale was back then in the ancient world, you got up every morning at dawn and did heavy physical work till it was dark. And you did that every day, basically until you were too old to do it anymore. We live in the modern world. We have the 5-day week. We have the 8-hour day. A lot of people are no longer doing physical work to make a living. And so, what do we really need the Sabbath for? We have 2 days of rest every weekend now. And so eventually the Sabbath was dropped. And by the end of the 19th century, the basic premise of Reform Judaism was the core of Judaism is ethical monotheism, the belief in one God, and the ethical teachings of Judaism, and everything else is optional. There's no reason to hold on to it if you really don't want to. They aren't essential parts of Judaism. And this really led to what people call classical reform. When when many German Jews emigrated to America in the middle of the 19th century, they brought Reform Judaism with them. And basically, it was the same thing. It was the service was in English in America. There was an organ or piano accompanying it. There was often a professional choir. The rabbi wore a ministerial robe and gave a sermon, which was not traditional, in Judaism. And as one rabbi described, it was basically a church where they didn't mention Jesus. It was a very church-like atmosphere. But for the German Jews who followed it, that was really what they felt they needed, to be good Germans, to be able to integrate into modern German society, and to have a religion that they wouldn't be embarrassed to invite their German Christian friends, to visit. And basically, they finally got citizenship, formal citizenship in 1870. When Bismarck finally created Germany as a modern nation, the Jews were granted citizenship. And the German Jews really became really hyper nationalistic Germans. They were really prouder of being German than they were of being Jewish. during the First World War, they volunteered for the Kaiser's army out of all proportion, to their percentage of the population. And even in America, it was kind of interesting. In the early years of the First World War, in 1914 and 15 and 16, before the United States got involved in it, there were only two groups in America that were really supporting the Germans in World War One. One were the German Jews. They were as proud of their German ancestry as they were of their Jewish ancestry. And they felt Germany had the most advanced civilization in the world. And of course, the other was the Irish, and they were for anybody who was fighting Britain. But it shows really the psychology of the German Jews. And in fact, some of them took it a step further. They figure, we really are not believers. Why stay with Judaism altogether? Wouldn't it be easier just to convert and really remove the last obstacle to being a real German? And that's what they did during the 19th century. German Jews, by the tens of thousands, converted to either Catholicism or Lutheranism in Germany, including some of the best people that the Jews produced. The greatest poet that Germany produced in the 19th century was Heinrich Heine, and he converted in the mid-19th century. His rationale was, he says, I'm an atheist anyway, so I can be a bad Christian just as easily as I can be a bad Jew, and it's going to go better for me. You saw it in Austria. Gustav Mahler wanted to be the director of the Vienna Opera, but in Austria you had to be a Catholic, to have that post. So he became a Catholic. Arnold Schoenberg converted and became a Catholic, although when he came to America as a refugee in the 30s, he reconverted back. So, but this was a common pattern. In fact, it really became a problem for the Nazis, when they took over in the 30s, because to the Nazis, religion didn't make any difference. They didn't really care about Judaism or Christianity. Their focus was on race. You were either an Aryan or a non-Aryan. Jews were non-Aryans. And the problem the Nazis had was there had been so much intermarriage and so many conversions during the 19th and early 20th centuries. There were millions of German families with Jewish ancestors. And so how were you going to separate out the Aryans and the non-Aryans? And finally, they came up with a rule, which is that they're only going to look back 2 generations. If both your parents and all 4 of your grandparents were not Jews, or converted Jews, then you were okay. They're not going to look back any further than that. And that became the criteria as far as the Jews were concerned, for the Nazis separating the Aryans from the non-Aryans. And in fact, the state of Israel took that up. When the state of Israel was founded in 48, one of the first things they passed was the law of return, which gave any Jew in the world, the right to Israeli citizenship who wanted it. And the question came up, well, how are we going to define a Jew? And they said, well, if one Jewish grandparent made you Jewish for the Nazis, then that's good enough for us. Anybody who has at least one Jewish grandparent will consider for Israeli citizenship. But in a sense, the debate that the Enlightenment started really is still going on. With Jews deciding how far they're going to go into the modern world. As I mentioned, you still have your enclaves in the big cities of people who totally reject the modern world. The Haredi Jews, the black hat and black coat people, who still believe that there's nothing outside the Jewish tradition of any real value for them, and the only way to really stay truly Jewish and to pass it on to your children is simply to not to let them have any contact with the secular world. You stay within your own community. And then, you have the modern Orthodox, you have the Reform, who really are still the biggest Jewish denomination in America. I think about 51% the last time anybody did a census. And then you have the other response to the modern world, which is try to devise something that's sort of an in-between path. And this is really what conservative Judaism is. It's really the only major branch of Judaism that really is founded in America. the Orthodox Judaism goes all the way back to Palestine in the 2nd century. Reform Judaism is a German import, but conservative Judaism really is an American creation. And there were a number of people in the 19th century who really believed that Reform Judaism had just thrown out the baby with the bathwater. It had gone way too far. They realized that for a lot of American Jews, Orthodox a lifestyle was not going to be an option for a variety of reasons. And they said there had to be some kind of middle approach where you could still keep a lot of Jewish tradition while participating fully, in the secular world. One of the events really historically which helped trigger that was one of the things the Reform movement in America did in the late 19th century was set up their own rabbinical seminary. And that was the Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in Ohio. It was a seminary still even today where they train Reform rabbis. And in 1885, they graduated their first class. And there was a banquet. It was to celebrate that. And the menu from that banquet has still been preserved. Actually, it's in some Jewish history books. The first course was shrimp cocktail. Then they went on to the soup, which was lobster bisque. And then the main course was prime rib, but they combined that with ice cream for dessert. And the Isaac Mayer Wise, who was the rabbi who really was the head of Reform Judaism in America, who oddly enough himself kept a kosher home. He swore up and down that it was a catering mistake. He never meant to do that. But a lot of the rabbis there really felt it was just kind of an in-your-face kind of gesture. If you weren't ready to eat the shrimp, you weren't ready to be a Reformed Jew. And a lot of rabbis actually got up and walked out. That was just a bridge too far for them. And these were among the people that in the last decade of the 19th century founded the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York, which is still the primary seminary for training conservative rabbis. It was the beginning of the conservative movement, in America. And basically the approach is, let's say for a teaching like not driving on the Sabbath. For Orthodox Jews, that's strictly forbidden. So basically, an Orthodox community has to be built around the synagogue. You have to be in walking distance of your synagogue. Reform Jews, again, believe that most of Sabbath law is no longer applicable. So it's no problem for them. You can do whatever you want on the Sabbath. And for conservative Jews, the reasoning was, well, you're balancing two values. One is the rabbinic, injunction against driving on the Sabbath, which does have some value, but you have to realize that the American lifestyle is suburban in modern America. And if you have people scattered through the suburbs, they're not going to walk 5 or 6 miles to the synagogue, on Saturday mornings. So you've got to balance one value against another. And the value of being able to come to the synagogue on Saturday morning, it outweighs the value, of not driving on Sabbath. And so in the conservative way, you can drive if it's necessary to go to services, but you can't stop at the Haywood Mall on the way home. So, it's kind of a compromise, between the two ends. But all of that, the situation you have today is really a product of the 18th century when Judaism just fractured, under the stresses of the modern world. All of them represent really Jewish responses to the European Enlightenment. Okay. Anybody have any comments or questions at this time?
Fred,
Nope.
going back to what you mentioned about the beginning of the Enlightened period and that the Jews lived in ghettos and were educated, weren't the masses basically illiterate? So that the Jews were an educated, literate group of people in a society that basically was illiterate. Am I
Yeah.
correct?
Yes.
So there was a lot of differentiation then just by virtue of
Yeah.
of the education versus non-education.
Yeah, there was, because the Ashkenazic Jews during the Middle Ages, they were living in a very backward Christian civilization. As you mentioned, most of them were illiterate. And there was really nothing in the outside world that the outside society had to offer that was any better than traditional Jewish culture. The Sephardic Jews were different. They were living in a brilliant Muslim culture, and, which accepted them. They had a totally different experience than the Ashkenazic Jews did. But you're right, the Ashkenazi Jews, up until the Enlightenment, were living in a society which really had nothing to it to tempt them at all. There was nothing in medieval Europe that was better than the culture that the Jews already
Yeah.
had. It wasn't until the Enlightenment, after you had Galileo and Newton and everything going on, after the Renaissance and the Reformation, then there was something really in European civilization to attract the Jews.
Mhm.
And then they had to decide, could you hang on to both things at one time?
Yeah.
The only Jews really that never had to make that decision really were the Polish and Russian Jews. Because, the Enlightenment never made it to Russia. And you can argue that it still hasn't made it to Russia. And so, the Ashkenazi Jews of Poland and Russia, Hungary, Romania, everywhere it was then the Tsarist Empire, were really not exposed to this. And so you really had a split in European Jewry after the 18th century. You had all the British and French and German, Dutch Jews, all of whom were assimilating into the cultures of their various countries. And you had the Russian Jews who were really still living in a ghettoized type of environment.
And
And
that's
that carried over to America also. For many years, the German Jews looked down on the Russian Jews. Most of the German Jews came a little bit earlier during the mid-19th century. Then after 1880, you had this flood of Ashkenazic Jews, Russian Jews coming into America. And they were really looked down on by the Germans. The Germans, were considered themselves superior because they were coming from a superior German culture.
and did they speak Yiddish
Yeah,
in
most of them were
temples?
Yiddish speaking. Yeah, which really the German Jews had gotten rid of, even though Yiddish began in Germany in the Middle Ages. One of Moses Mendelssohn's aims when he tried to bring the German Jews into the modern world was he wanted them to stop speaking Yiddish. To Mendelssohn, to the reformers in the Enlightenment, Yiddish was Jewish Ebonics. It was a ghetto jargon. A corrupt.
Yiddish
It was really it was a
Ebonics.
corrupted. It was really a ghetto jargon, a corrupted form of German. And the first thing that Mendelssohn thought Jews had to do was to stop speaking Yiddish, learn to speak modern High German,
Mhm.
in order to become real Germans. In fact, one of the things that he did was kind of interesting. He did his own translation of the Torah into German. It was the first translation of the Bible into German, really, since Martin Luther had done it back at the time of the Reformation. But what he did was it was in German, but he spelled out the words using the Hebrew alphabet, which is really clever because that's what Yiddish speakers do. Yiddish basically is mostly German origin words, but you write it using the letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So that's what Yiddish speaking German Jews were used to doing. So Mendelssohn's Torah translation, it was written with the letters of the Hebrew alphabet, but the German was modern High German. It was a way of getting these ghetto Jews to learn modern High German. It was really very effective. By the end of the 19th century, very few Western European Jews were still speaking Yiddish anymore. They had pretty much gotten rid of it in most of Germany and the other European countries. And the only people speaking it were the Eastern European Jews, the Polish and Russian Jews. But this still carried over into the modern world. In the Zionist development of Palestine, one of the things a lot of the Zionist pioneers tried to do was get rid of Yiddish. They didn't want to have Yiddish spoken in Palestine or in the modern state of Israel because they really felt the Yiddish was the language of the medieval ghetto. And to them, it brought back all these memories of Jews as being helpless and persecuted. all the things the state of Israel was really supposed to be the antidote for. The first Yiddish printing press was set up in Tel Aviv in 1924, and it was firebombed. It was firebombed by a bunch of Zionists who really felt that Yiddish should have no place in the modern state of Israel. So a lot of those battles were still really being fought, even in the modern era.
Is Yiddish today kind of died out?
Well, if people thought that it probably would, it's having kind of a small renaissance. You know, a lot of young Jews now really want to learn it. The immigrants who came over from Russia, never bothered to teach it to their children. So you have a lot of, well, like I grew up in a Yiddish speaking home, but my parents never really, thought to teach me Yiddish. The feeling was, what does an American Jew need Yiddish for? So you have the second generation after the immigrants. Most of them grew up not knowing Yiddish, even though they heard their parents speak it. The odd thing is that a lot of their great grandchildren want to learn it again.
Ah,
There's
okay.
actually a department of Yiddish at Duke where they publish a textbook of Yiddish. There's another department of Yiddish at Columbia University in New York. There's a Yiddish Culture and Book Center now in Amherst in Massachusetts. And so there's some signs of a revival. Though personally, I'm kind of skeptical of that's really ever going to catch on, because to really appreciate Yiddish, you really have to appreciate the culture that it came out of. And these are not observant Jews. It's really the language of a dead European culture, and I'm kind of skeptical whether it's really ever going to catch on again. In this country. A good example would be if you take a Yiddish expression like this that you commonly, my mother used to use it all the time, Jeder Montag and Donnerstag. And these Jeder Montag and Donnerstag are all German-derived words. It just means every Monday and Thursday. And any German Gentile would really know what the words meant, but he wouldn't know what it really meant. It's based on the fact that in a traditional Orthodox synagogue where they have a daily service, a portion of the Torah is read every Monday and Thursday morning. It's a carryover from ancient Israel where the market days were on Monday and Thursday mornings. And so, with Ezra the scribe, you did the public readings of the Torah on those days besides the Sabbath. And so basically the intent, the meaning of the thing overall is something which is done over and over again on a regular basis. So when Yiddish speaking Jews use an expression like Jeder Montag and Donnerstag, it's really a sarcastic expression that means here we go again. You know. And that's something that, that you wouldn't really be able to know the real meaning of it unless you understood the religious culture that it came out of.
Yeah.
So I'm personally kind of skeptical that this modern revival of Yiddish is really gonna succeed. But we'll just have to wait and see.
So what you're saying is really interesting. It's a segment of that time that the Yiddish evolved, and then it's really kind of died out. I mean, my grandfather spoke Yiddish, and in their family they spoke Yiddish.
Yeah.
And
Well, you never know. Maybe it will revive. Nobody ever thought that Hebrew would ever be revived and become the language of a modern industrial nation.
yeah,
Yeah, that sounded totally crazy when they talked about that in the 19th century. So it's really hard to predict these things.
yeah, because on my grandfather's side, they were Russian and Polish.
Yeah, and those are the ones that kept them
Yeah,
alive.
yeah.
Yeah,
I've learned that
yeah.
through you. These are things I've never known.
Yeah. Well, the odd thing was, Yiddish before then, before the 19th century, was totally a spoken language. There was very little of anything written in Yiddish. But when it migrated east in the 19th century, you had Russian writers who made it into a great literary language. People like
Mhm.
Sholem Aleichem, who wrote the stories that eventually became Fiddler on the Roof. I think Moses Mendelssohn would have been totally flabbergasted if somebody told him that 200 years in the future, Isaac Bashevis Singer will get the Nobel Prize in Literature for writing in Yiddish and will
Hmm.
give the first Nobel Prize acceptance speech ever in Yiddish. So
Hmm.
you never know about these things.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Okay, well, I'm gonna knock off a little bit earlier today. I've got to get over to the synagogue by 7 o'clock. The rabbi's
Okay.
doing a thing
Well-
over there. But for
Are
next
you
week,
going to study all night?
I hope not. God, I hope not. But next week we can talk about the Russian Jews, the Eastern European Jews that our ancestors at the Enlightenment never got to.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Okay,
Thanks,
you,
Fred.
Brad.
We'll do that next week. Okay.
Thanks so much.
See y'all next
Thank
week.
you all.
you.
Good night.
Good
Good
night.
night. Bye, guys.